Gracias. Good morning, everyone. Could I have the slide mover, please, the remote? Thank you very much. And, and thank you to the Academy for organizing this wonderful meeting. And of course, for the audience with the Pope yesterday. So this morning's session, we already heard a good amount about the impacts on um, vulnerable communities, particularly women and children. And I'd like to continue on the same theme based on some experience in India and a recent scoping review that we did. Um, and as I mentioned, very inspiring yesterday, and particularly to read the text of his speech, where the Pope also specifically mentions the disproportionate impacts on women and children. COP28 was the first COP, as we all know, that actually had a day dedicated to health, despite the fact that the WHO and Maria has been one of the champions for really looking at the health impacts as one of the major issues that we have to confront. In addition, of course, to the loss of other species. But this, unfortunately, it took 28 COPs for health really to be on the agenda, and the same with agriculture. But now, finally, they are on the agenda. While the health declaration at COP28 includes close partnerships with women and children, it does not really address the disproportionate impacts again. And again, quoting a WHO document on protecting maternal, newborn, and child health from the impacts of climate change, the effects of climate change on women's health are still underreported and underestimated. And I think this was also brought out by Professor Haynes and other speakers this morning. There have been various estimates, again, of the larger number of people that are going to be pushed into poverty, and again, more women and girls are going to be impacted. And according to UN Environment, 80% of the people displaced by climate change are women or girls. Now, climate change and global warming impacts health and health systems in many different ways. And starting from the bottom of this slide, you see the various changes in ecology, whether it's soil loss or whether it's global temperature rise in the water, on land, extreme weather events. All of these have impacts on the social and structural determinants of health and environmental determinants of health. And this, in turn, of course, affects health systems. We've seen repeatedly when there are floods, when there are disasters, that healthcare workers and health systems are as impacted as ordinary people, living in those communities. And so we do need to think about how to strengthen health systems as well and make them climate resilient. And then on top, you can see the various impacts from heat, post-traumatic stress, the lung diseases and heart diseases due to air pollution, vector-borne diseases. So mosquitoes that spread dengue, for example, are adapting very rapidly and spreading around the world, increasing malnutrition and, of course, conflicts and migration. There's now a well-grounded basis for stating that the climate crisis is not gender neutral, and there are many different ways in which women and girls experience the impacts differently. Across the world, we know women have less access to natural resources. Land rights, for example, if you look across countries, you find that it varies. But in some countries, land rights, the difference between men and women, women have only about 10% of the land rights that men have. But this goes up to, say, 50, 60% in countries like Vietnam. We know that agriculture is the most important employment sector for women in low and low middle income countries. And therefore, anything that impacts their crops, like drought or erratic rainfall, they have to work harder to secure the same income. And of course, it's girls who often have to leave school to help their mothers to manage the increased burden. And even today, you travel in rural areas across Africa, across Asia, you will find the older girl sibling looking after the younger child when the mother has to go to work. There was a recent FAO report also called The Unjust Climate, and they have actually made some estimates of the amount of losses And again, showing that female headed households lost 8% more of their income every year than male headed households with heat. This was 3% with floods. And so, households run by women, uh, the losses are much greater. And again, there's a prediction that if temperatures increase by a further 1 degrees, then female headed households could lose up to 34% of their income compared to male headed households. And to the question, is there enough finance going towards supporting rural women in a changing climate? The answer is a resounding no. Only 6% of funds focused on agri-food systems actually are focused on gender equality and women's empowerment. And again, um, only 6% of national climate policies or the nationally determined contributions even mention women in a significant manner. We looked at state action plans for climate change in India that are derived from the National Action Plan and found that only 4 out of the 28 or so states actually had a truly gender responsive climate action plan. So there is a substantial opportunity here to increase attention to gender equality, both within climate and agricultural policies. Um, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But again, just looking at India as an example, and of course, India is a subcontinent. On the left-hand side, you see a slide which shows that 75% of Indian districts are vulnerable to what we call extreme hydromet events. In fact, this is a map produced by CEEW, that Arnaba was talking about yesterday. And, the losses run into $10 billion. I think Sunita also mentioned that last year, almost on every day of the year, there was one climate disaster somewhere in India or the other. The middle map really shows us where the heat waves are going to be very severely impacting people. And on the right-hand side, actually, is areas which have very high air pollution levels, the areas in red. The areas in green doesn't mean that they don't have uh, uh, they don't have poor air quality, they do. But the ones in red are like 10 times above, 8 to 10 times above the WHO cutoff. So you can imagine the millions and millions of people that live in those areas. Again, this comes from the Lancet countdown showing that, it's again numbers. Average summer temperatures uh, have gone up, conditions suitable for malaria now 1/3 of the year, when previously it was just the monsoons. 29% of India's land in the last decade experienced over 3 months of extreme drought, and a huge number of deaths in India attributable to high PM 2.5 generated from human activities. So, again, all anthropogenic. Now, again, these are many ways in which women are impacted. Um, UNDP estimates that women are 14 times more likely than men to die in a disaster. But crop failure, water scarcity, conflicts, lack of access to healthcare because women are spending more time either bringing water or firewood, um, and displacement, of course. Either women are migrating with the men or they're left behind in their villages while men migrate to urban areas, and both have different sets of issues. Uh, so I'll go quickly over some of these slides because we know, I think, and we can always go into more details on what the actual biological impacts are of each of these hazards and threats. But one of the analysis we did showed that women who live in districts in India that have been exposed to repeated droughts in the last 10 years not only had higher underweight, but the incidence of things like girl-child marriage, teenage pregnancies, and very staggeringly, intimate partner violence, domestic violence increased by a huge 26%. And again, there are intersectionalities always. It's not all women, of course, are not the same, and all women are not equally vulnerable. There are men, there are, others elderly, there are disabled people who are also vulnerable. But when you combine the intersectionality of poverty, sometimes of religion or caste or other kinds of marginalization, and being a woman or a girl, then of course it all adds up. Again, we've heard about children this morning, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but again, the analysis we did on the impacts of exposure to either droughts, floods, or cyclones showed that things like child stunting, child underweight, even child mortality, diarrhea, child immunization, all of these, so we can see setbacks in many of the health indicators. So it's going to be more difficult to reach the SDG 3 goals and because of the impact on climate. Of course, education is also severely impacted, and children, we already lost a lot of education during the pandemic. especially, and again, low middle income countries where schools were closed, and now there are further disruptions because of climate. Now, just switching over to why climate action needs women and children. So they're not just the victims and should not be considered victims, but really should have to be and are part of the solution. And there is data that you give women the same access to resources as men, for example, in agriculture, they can increase their agricultural yields significantly more. And we know that, I'll just take 2 more minutes, that indigenous women or tribal women have been at the forefront of environmental conservation, and they have a lot of invaluable knowledge and expertise that can help to build resilience. And again, I think we are going to hear from children this afternoon, so I won't go into let the children speak for themselves. But certainly women are agents of change. But unfortunately, when you look at data on women's representation, even if you look at the delegations to COP, I think it was, 10% or less of women. We look at delegations, to any of the UN high-level bodies, you look at parliaments, you look at decision-making bodies overall, women are underrepresented, and more so women from marginalized groups are not included. So we need much more inclusive, and I think that can be one of the recommendations, that decisions that are being made should not be made for people. They should really be involved in those decisions. Again, I don't have a lot of time, but some of the approaches we've taken, like farming systems for nutrition, where you involve women, you involve the communities in designing nutrition-sensitive agriculture that improves dietary diversity, ends up in improving nutritional outcomes, and makes them more climate resilient. I think those are the kind of co-designed solutions, which are going to vary by agroecological zone, but again, it needs a participatory approach. And while we were looking at examples across India, we saw several examples, and just 3 on this slide, of women-led solutions. Eco-sand toilets for areas in Jharkhand which get flooded every year, where women did not have access to toilets during the flooded season, so they built these elevated, very ecologically sensitive toilets. Climate resilient schools in Uttarakhand, it's a program that's a public-private partnership program, and then strengthening indigenous food systems, again, reviving the neglected and underutilized foods that tribal people or rural people use. But today, with the over-commercialization of food, many of those neglected and nutritious foods have been forgotten. So just to end, I think some thoughts for the future, and what we've learned is that national action plans, they must be gender transformative and must allocate resources specifically to address issues related to women and children. And large countries like India, state action plans need to do the same. We've heard a lot about cities. Certainly, pregnant women, young children there must be special provision to protect them from the impacts of heat and air pollution. And doctors and health ministries must really become advocates for policies in other sectors that will help mitigate the adverse impacts of climate change on health, whether it is transport, whether it's buildings, whether it's air quality. These actions need to be taken by other ministries, but the stewardship needs to be with the health departments. And we need vulnerability mapping at a granular level so that governments know what to act, where to act, and when to act. The increase in gender-based and intimate partner violence is extremely worrying, and so we need solutions, and obviously men need to be part of the solution, but and that's a complex, very complex issue. I think we heard yesterday that access to clean cooking fuel, this could be one of the low-hanging fruits that becomes a global priority, because again, not only is it good for climate, but it's also good for women's health. Livelihoods of rural, particularly agricultural women, need what we may call climate proofing, new technologies, skilling, green jobs, eco jobs, etc. We can use new technologies, but they must be shared equitably. And I was witness to the inequities during the pandemic, the sharing of vaccines and other health products. Similar things I think one can see in climate change, where there are technologies around the world, but they're not necessarily being shared with people who might need them most urgently. And financing, I think we had a lot of discussion on how we need to really change the way that we're financing, rather than being in silos, but combine it to address multiple challenges. And finally, I think gender equality must be a very strong component, and we have to constantly remind people to include that and when we talk about solutions for climate change. Thank you very much.